We begin on the ground in Vancouver, where the CBC's Georgie Smythe is at the port. So, Georgie, there's been a lot of activity over the week. What's going on there right now?
Yes, there have been developments aplenty in the Port of Vancouver today. Port workers were striking from late yesterday until early this morning when those picket lines came back down after the Canada Industrial Relations Board ruled that the work stoppage was unlawful because the union hadn't provided a 72-hour work stoppage notice. That's a decision the union is now appealing. But let me step out of the shot here and you can take a look at Canada's largest and most important port and work that's not happening there today. Very quiet, and we're all hoping that the work is happening behind the scenes instead. For instance, we did hear from the union a short time ago who confirmed that it had now issued a second strike notice explaining, which will mean it'll be stopping work on Saturday morning. And it also explained its caucus's position and why it wasn't satisfied with the mediators deal that it was presented with last week. It said it regretted the economic impact of the strike and urged the government to stay out of their collective bargaining. We also heard from the Employees Association via another statement, and it said the reissuance of a second strike notice would basically guarantee a repeat of actions and impacts that last week's strike had on the economy. We spoke to an industrial relations expert this morning just to understand where this all leaves us now.
If they're talking to the media, they're not negotiating. Back in the days when we had these 3-day strikes, everybody went back to work. They knew what was going to happen. It was all very, very orchestrated. And so now that pattern has been broken. So I think in the end that the minister has made up his mind that they're going to act, and they're working on what that will be.
Okay, so Georgie, that's the state of play between the union and the employers, but obviously this ripples through the Canadian economy. What are business groups saying about the economic impacts of all of this?
Yeah, well, unsurprisingly, they're quite upset with this new development. We've heard from many business associations across the country who tell us just how upset this news has been to them. Some say that the work stoppage is costing the economy hundreds of $millions a day. We've certainly spoken to the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade many times in the last few weeks, who tell us that the last time that they striked for 13 days, it disrupted the economy to the tune of $9.7 billion in trade disruption. They also estimate that the work stoppage is preventing about 60,000 containers from coming into the port. And if this work stoppage extends until the end of this month, that number could balloon out until to 250,000 containers that have been prevented from entering BC's ports. Over the course of the last few weeks, CBC has spoken to a range of businesses who tell us just how difficult it is to be agile in these really challenging conditions. So as it stands, the union has told us that it's willing to be back at the bargaining table as soon as possible and is happy to stay there for as long as it takes. And we do know that work will be continuing at the port later today.
Okay, Georgie, thank you so much. That's the CBC's Georgie Smythe in Vancouver. Okay, for more on this, we have Perrin Beatty in studio. He is the president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. So, Mr. Beatty, thanks for joining us yet again. Last time we spoke, you were very relieved because there was a deal. What's your mood right now?
Not relieved, to put it mildly. I'm very worried about where we are. We hadn't unclogged the bottleneck before this second strike started, and it takes an awful lot longer to unscramble the egg than it does to scramble it in the first place. So we have this incredible bottleneck that's backed up all the way through the supply chains in Canada, and now we're adding more to that. The economic consequences for Canadians in every part of the country are going to be enormous.
You were worried also about reputational damage of the strike that you thought could be abated because it did end. There was a collective agreement and things went back to work, and now we have the stop, and potentially starting again situation. What does that do?
It's a major concern because what it means is that international shippers looking at going in and out of Canada are going to ask themselves whether they can count on West Coast ports to do it. And they're apt to ship through the United States instead of shipping through Canada. It means lost jobs from Canada. It means lost income for Canadians as well. So it's very bad news if we scare people away. And one of the issues in this new strike is the question of the length of the contract itself. What had been proposed by the mediator was a 4-year contract, which would give us some stability and a chance to restore our reputation.
Right, and the union says that's too long. And for people who like stability, you can understand they might want another crack at reopening the contract, but for business groups and shippers, they want to know there's going to be labor peace for a 4-year period.
Exactly. You have to send the message to people that if you're dealing with Canada, you've got stability. You know what you're dealing with. Otherwise, people simply go elsewhere.
So the Prime Minister has convened the Incident Response Group, which is essentially high-level officials and high-level cabinet ministers, and this is one of the issues on the agenda. Seamus O'Regan, the Labour Minister, who was with them trying to encourage and negotiate a settlement, now sounds quite frustrated. In the public statements he said, calling the strike illegal, which is something for the Labour Minister to say. What do you think the government is going to do right now?
I don't know what they are going to do. I know what they should do, and they need to get Parliament back as rapidly as possible. Until members of Parliament go back to work, the longshoremen won't be going back to work. And what's absolutely critical here is that we put the interest of the country as a whole ahead of everything else. It is every single hour that goes by that we keep these ports closed, the damage compounds, and the impact on Canadian families, Canadian businesses, Canadian communities is enormous.
Is that the only way forward now, from your point of view, given what's happened in the negotiations between the players? I mean, the mediator wrote an agreement that, at least initially, they said was good enough until, I guess, it got circulated more widely and the union side said no. I mean, is back-to-work legislation the only option at this point?
I believe so. I was so relieved and so happy last time we spoke because we had an agreement. Both what we had was an independent mediator who wrote his recommendations, and both the union and management said, we agree, and let's get things reopened. Then the union changed its position, and then it went out on strike again with an illegal strike. This just puts Canada and the Canadian economy in a very uncertain spot.
But you say you want to get Parliament back, and it's on break for the summer. It's a minority Parliament. And the Confidence and Supply Agreement is the Liberals, the New Democrats. The NDP has made it very clear they're not going to support back-to-work legislation. And it's not at all clear to me if the Conservatives will, at least based on their public statement. How easy do you think it is to get it through this particular Parliament? Because it doesn't seem to be an obvious vocal partner for the Liberals at this point in time.
Members of Parliament are going to be hearing from their constituents, and they're going to be making themselves loud and clear. The provincial premiers have weighed in now, a series of them on this. And it's going to be very clear to members of Parliament that we need to settle this. The Port of Montreal strike was settled in a day, and this is dragged on for 13 days and is being renewed. You're a student of history. I think you'll be interested. It was hard to believe, but 50 years ago was my first summer as a member of Parliament, and we were called back in the summer from the break by Prime Minister Trudeau, who led a minority government, because the railway non-op workers had gone on strike. He declared it an emergency and said that we had to legislate them back to work. Parliament came back, legislated it back to work, and things got moving again.
The Port of Montreal comparison gets brought up. The argument from the government saying the two aren't similar is because negotiations there had dragged on for years. There was no deal within sight, and we were in the middle of a pandemic, and you needed that port to get critical supplies in. And they argue this situation is not the same because there was progress being made at the bargaining table. But I guess your view is that what's happened in the last 24, 36 hours completely changes that scenario.
And I would argue that it's not the same for another reason. The Port of Montreal is a vital port for Canada, but it's Canada's second largest port. On the West Coast, the first and third largest ports in Canada, and about 30 others, are affected by this strike. This means the damage is much more severe than the damage that was being done in the case of the Montreal port strike. It's vital that members of Parliament do their job. If I'm more worried if members of Parliament withdraw their services than if the port workers withdraw theirs, because what it means is that Canadians aren't being served.
So how much time do you think the government can give this? I mean, the 72-hour clock is ticking down to Saturday. Do you give it a bit of a window there to see if there can be a compromise reached between now and when the picket lines might go back up, or do you have to recall Parliament right away?
I believe that Parliament should be recalled right away. If there's a settlement between now and then, great, that's tremendous. All of us would like to see it. But what we shouldn't do is simply dither and wait to see on Saturday whether or not there's been an agreement, and then add a couple more days to the damage that's being done. Government needs to send a very clear message now that they're standing up for the interests of Canadians, of all Canadians, and members of Parliament need to get back to work.
Okay, Perrin Beatty, President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, for more on this story and its national implications, we've reached Bea Bruske. She is the president of the Canadian Labour Congress and joins us now from Winnipeg. So Bea, leaders calling for back-to-work legislation. We heard it from a lot of premiers and the business groups. How do you respond to those calls?
Well, we certainly think that 72 hours is a very long time in the world of bargaining and labor relations. And so we know that that gives the parties an opportunity to get meaningfully back to the bargaining table and to address the issues that are keeping us from having a ratified collective agreement.
But from your perspective, how do negotiations continue from here when it looked like the leadership had an agreement in place, and then when it was circulated more widely, the union backed away?
Well, certainly ILWU followed their constitution, and they have a contract caucus that reviews a tentative deal. That contract caucus made the decision that this deal did not meaningfully enough address the issues that their members sent them to the bargaining table with. And so that means that we really need to make sure that the parties get back to that table to have further conversations on issues like automation, on issues like contracting out, to make sure that these jobs can be safeguarded. We're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 jobs that are potentially on the line in the future as automation takes hold in this particular industry. So it's critically important that we support workers that work all up and down the coast of British Columbia, that have family and community sustaining jobs, and we need to make sure that they continue to be community and family sustaining jobs into the future.
But what about all those other workers in community and family sustaining jobs that are along the supply chains right now that are being significantly disrupted by this on again, off again, potentially on again strike at the BC ports? We've seen potash producers shut down in Saskatchewan, the knock-on effect in the auto sector and the energy sector and just the retail sector. It looks like it's been quite significant, and it looks like any prolonging is going to make it even worse.
We agree that there's been a significant impact, obviously, on other industries, but there is 72 hours that we have right now before Saturday morning. The parties do have an opportunity to sit back down at that bargaining table to address these issues. At the end of the day, we need to value all jobs, and we need to make sure that we're properly addressing these particular issues that this particular industry has at this moment in time. Right now, we're talking about longshore workers. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about different kinds of workers. We need to be able to support all workers in Canada to build a strong economy. And, making sure that we can actually reach those agreements across the bargaining table means that we have more stability in these different sectors.
The government, though, it endured a strike and a work stoppage that went on for 13 days before it got to the point of getting the mediator to essentially write a tentative agreement based on the inputs they'd received from the parties. And now that process has obviously failed, and you can see the frustration in the public commentary and the public statements coming from the cabinet ministers who have been speaking on this today. I mean, based on your read of that, what's your sense of how likely back-to-work legislation appears to be at this moment in time?
Well, we heard it from your previous guest that back-to-work legislation is something that the demand for it is coming from many corners, right? Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that workers are just as frustrated. Workers would rather be at work, but at the same time, workers need to have protections to know that they can actually afford to live in the communities, that they can actually raise their families in these communities, and that their jobs are not going to be threatened in the future by contracting out and by automation. So the frustration is on every side. It's not just a one-way street. And so we really are calling on Ottawa to get these parties back to the bargaining table and to more meaningfully address the final issues so that we can actually reach a tentative agreement. Nothing would be nicer than to reach a tentative agreement by Saturday morning that meaningfully addresses these points, and that is going to allow for a ratified collective agreement.
So what if we get to Saturday morning and the picket lines go back up because there is no deal, and the first and third biggest ports in the country are disrupted and critical supply chains are even further tangled up, and the knock-on economic effect is more profound? I mean, what is a government supposed to do when you've seen the mood shifting on this? I mean, what does the government do if this goes back up on Saturday morning?
Well, obviously, government is going to do what they believe is in the best interest of our economy, but I would argue the best interest of our economy is to actually push these parties to get a deal done. When we have the 5 largest global shipping companies in the last year alone taking in $100 billion in profits, an increase of 1,500% since 2019, when workers' wages are lagging behind, when workers' job protections are lagging behind, I think there's a long way to go here to actually addressing these things in a meaningful way and to get to a deal.
Are you surprised the workers rejected this deal based on the fact that what the mediator put on the table, what was acceptable to the people who were in the room at the time? Are you surprised it got to the point? Because this is an uncommon thing, it seems to me, for something to be rejected so quickly and so out of hand.
I think that for most workers in Canada now, the reality of ratifying a collective agreement is more challenging because the demands are higher because workers have been put through the ringer over the last number of years. We've seen runaway inflation. We've seen significant increases in the cost of housing, groceries, and everything else. The demands and the expectations are significantly heightened. And so for the bargaining committee to make a decision at the table to bring that to their caucus, they've gone through their democratic process as it's outlined in their constitution, and we have to adhere to that, and we have to respect that process. These are folks that were appointed and elected by the respective members of the various different locals, and so we stand by the decisions that their members are going to be making.
Bea Bruske, it's always good to talk to you. That's the president of the Canadian Labour Congress, Bea Bruske in Winnipeg. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
PC port workers say they will resume striking as soon as Saturday. This after the Federal Industrial Relations Board declared the latest job action illegal. Meanwhile, the federal government is facing opposition pressure to end the strike.
Justin Trudeau must do his job and end this strike immediately because of the massive cost to workers, consumers, and businesses. And we're calling on him to deliver a plan to end this strike within the next 24 hours.
To look at the options the federal government has at this point, we turn to Lisa Raitt. Lisa, of course, is a vice chair of global investment banking at CIBC and a former federal minister of labor. All right, Lisa, Pierre Poilievre says he wants a plan in 24 hours. So given his deadline, what can Seamus O'Regan and the rest of the government do at this point to settle this?
Well, there are three options. He goes in and he puts pressure on the parties at the table to come up with their own solution that the committee is going to recommend for ratification to the membership. That's number one. That's the best solution, quite frankly, David, because that means the parties have it in their own control. Option number two is if the minister believes that this is a really good deal and that perhaps it's not getting to the members as it should, he can order a vote. I mean, it is a swinging for the fences kind of moment, and not a lot of people use the tool, but it's a tool nonetheless. He would order a vote. Strike still continues as the vote happens, so it's more processy than you'd like to have. Doesn't really stop what's happening in terms of work stoppage, but maybe you end up getting a worker kind of movement that likes this deal. Unlikely. So option three is the last one, and that is the traditional back to work legislation by bringing back Parliament and introducing legislation that's going to implement some kind of a deal on them, or perhaps arbitration.
Okay, so those are the paths that are there. I wonder what you divine from the tone of the government. It sounded more angry and more frustrated than at any point so far. So how do you interpret that, and what do we draw from that reaction?
Yeah, it's a roller coaster. Sorry, David. It's a roller coaster of emotions. I mean, there was elation when the deal was struck. Then there was this concern expressed very strongly that patience was no longer their forte when it came to having the strike. Earlier today, it was the Canadian Labour CIRB, Canadian Industrial Relations Board, ruled that, in fact, the union did not give proper notice for 72 hours for the strike to continue again or start again on July 18. So the minister puts out a tweet that says this strike is illegal. Harsh language. I mean, yes, they missed the notification period, but the strike itself, like the big strike that we're all thinking about, it's not illegal. And I'm hoping that they end up coming to a deal themselves, quite frankly, because it looks like the government is beginning to get very frustrated with the union.
Yeah, and the union did comply with that ruling right away, took the picket lines down and issued that proper 72-hour notice. So based on everything, and based on the roller coaster of emotions, based on the thought they had a deal, and based on the economic circumstances that are there and the time they've given it, do you think they've reached the point where this government can justify and sell the use of back-to-work legislation?
I think they've been backed into a corner. They have to. And it's the other external that you need to mention as well is that have they done enough to fulfill what the Supreme Court has said is the right amount of process to ensure that you're not breaching somebody's rights to collective bargaining? And that's the important test, I would assume, for this government. And I would submit they have done enough so they can bring in back to work legislation, bring the House back, and see how they fare in terms of how long it will take for them to get through it.
Okay, so bringing the House back in the summer is not going to be popular with any of the parties, but back to work legislation in particular will not be popular with the New Democrats, and that's who they've relied on for a while now to pass legislation. Do you think the confidence and supply agreement could survive back to work legislation?
Well, is back to work legislation something that is a confidence motion? I don't think it is. But it's up to the government whether they declare it as such and put it back into the hands of the NDP as to whether or not they want to push the matter. I would not bet against the NDP in terms of how they feel about back to work legislation. This is very central to their thesis and to how they feel about labor relations, that everyone has the right to strike and they have the right to collectively bargain their own agreement. So I would say it's a tough one for the NDP. It would be very interesting for the Liberal government to make it a confidence motion. But other than that, of course, it survives. It just means that they disagree on this matter, and everyone proceeds as it never happened.
Yeah, even with the the underpinning of the whole thing is no surprises, right? That's what they said on day one. Do you think this would qualify as a surprise if you're Jagmeet Singh and his caucus?
No, it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, the mechanics of getting to a strike and the mechanics of getting to a deal are very well known. They're set out in legislation. The timing is known of it. Everyone could see this coming from a million miles away. So no, there's no surprise here. And I think Mr. Singh actually came out very early and said we are not going to support back to work legislation. And maybe that's why the Liberals have taken a bit of a beat in terms of trying to figure out how to move this along and didn't rush for back to work right away.
So, okay, clearly the New Democrats aren't going to support it, so they need another party. The Conservatives, it's unclear to me. They said that they blame the government for this, as they do on many issues, and they say they want the government to solve it ASAP. But it was unclear to me from Pierre Poilievre's answers whether or not they would vote for back-to-work legislation. What do you think the Conservatives would do? Could they count on the Conservatives to end this port strike if that's what it takes?
Yeah, I don't know. I actually don't know. I was at Stampede last week. I talked to Perrin Beatty at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I talked to a number of my former colleagues who sit in Parliament right now. And at that moment in time, prior to the deal being announced, they were uncertain as to whether or not there was going to be this move towards supporting back to work legislation. So I don't know the answer to the question. I think things may have changed a little bit. There's definitely more pressure. And the fact that you can see this very large, I would say, yawning gap of possibility of this strike continuing well into September, I mean, that's scary. And maybe that'll be something that'll get through to the opposition in terms of how the leader's office is feeling about this.
Okay, Lisa, always appreciate the time. That's former federal labor minister Lisa Raitt.
Thanks.